Welcome to another exciting edition of The Perspective. Today we discuss flying in Africa. Air travel in Africa is significantly expensive compared to other regions. In today's discussion, we dissect the reasons and the factors that drive this elevated cost. They include undeveloped or underdeveloped infrastructure, limited competition, high taxes, and the operational costs of local airlines. As usual, I am joined by Abi Agina, my very good friend and a veteran journalist, who is also a financial communications expert. Abi, thanks for coming and talking to us.
Thanks, and great to see you again. Looking forward to this exciting discussion.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
All right.
Yeah. So, Abi, this is a very exciting discussion. I also like flying, but sometimes I get constraints when it comes to the cost. I don't know how much you have flown, but this should be a very, very confusing topic for me.
Indeed. Well, Sam, when you look at the numbers, they are not looking very well in terms of the average number of traffic in Africa, in terms of air traffic. When you look at right now, according to the International Air Transport Association, IATA, it estimates that out of every 100 customers flying, only 2 are Africans. This tells you that globally, Africans flying is just at about 2% of the average. What does this mean? It means we have to fix our aviation as a region. When you look back 47 years ago, Sam, we had the East African Airways. This was a very great initiative that saw Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya having one regional airline. The airline, unfortunately, did not manage to run the test of time. Eventually, when we fast forward to now, all those countries have airlines. You have Kenya Airways, Rwanda Air, Uganda Airlines, Tanzanian Airlines, Burundi as well. So there is a lot of interest in aviation by the fact that already we are seeing all these countries within East Africa having their own airlines. And when I look at right now, one of the biggest opportunities for the region is how can they scale up infrastructure that can allow for airlines to make money. As it stands, majority of these airlines are literally struggling to keep up in the air. Why? It is very expensive. Aviation is capital intensive. Purchasing one Dreamliner costs you about $15 billion. That is not little money. So you can imagine airlines that are trying to compete with other airlines within Africa. It becomes a big challenge. And for example, right now, we see there's a lot of vibe where people want to travel. Airlines are coming up with packages. I see Rwandair having a package to Kamembe. Yeah. I see other airlines.
Domestic flights.
Domestic flights.
Yes.
When you look at Uganda Airlines, they also have something. Kenya Airways, they also have something. It also shows you that there is a hunger among the population to travel. But I like the words you use. You like flying, but it's not pocket friendly.
Yeah. But if you look at the way these airlines grow in number, you've just given us examples within the East African region. Every day they purchase a new Airbus. Every day they bring up another plane. They bring up different initiatives. Mm-hmm. For me, it should be like a step forward to actually reduce these costs.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but at the end of the day, it depends with how can the countries have laws that allow them to be able to harmonize all these issues around flying. One of the biggest costs to an air ticket are the taxes. There's, of course, the use of the airport. They call it the landing right, you know. There's a host of other small related costs that add up to your eventual ticket. And all this is simply because countries are not speaking to each other. So there's a lot of double taxation happening, and this, in essence, has a big impact on the cost of an air ticket. Give you a quick example. Flying from Kigali to Nairobi on a return ticket will cost you nothing less than $600. If you go to Europe and look at the air prices, the fares are very significantly low. A case in point, in Eastern Europe, you see there are over 200 airlines servicing that region. In Africa, combined, we have not more than 30 airlines. So what does that tell you? It actually confirms the reality that this being a very high capital intense industry, it sort of limits the ability that African governments can be able to venture forward. Of course, we have very good examples. When you look at sister countries like Ethiopia, they have managed to build a very strong aviation industry with Ethiopian Airlines. This is one of the airlines that is actually right now running one of the biggest fleets.
Actually, it's one of the biggest on the continent.
Exactly.
Yes.
So how did they do it? They have a lot of government backing. Because when you look at a case in point, I was studying the books of Uganda Airlines. The airline alone is able to generate revenue that meets 85% of its operational costs. So it means there's a deficit of about 15%. Who meets that 15%? That's where the government steps in.
Yeah, should
So eventually, many carriers in Africa right now are not making profits. Case in point, we have Kenya Airways. They made their first profit after 8 years this year. Imagine 8 years of running losses. The same applies to a few other airlines within the region. So the potential is there to grow the aviation industry, but there has to be some very solid incentives that can be able to change the policy environment. In the event that this is addressed, we're likely to see far better outcomes in terms of growing the aviation industry and reducing the prices, because many of the middle class want to travel. When you look at the numbers by IATA, I'd like to just take you through these numbers, Sam, and allow me to refer to these numbers because I'm a numbers guy and I don't want to misquote.
Yes, please.
So when I look at the IATA numbers, and these numbers I've actually picked not from IATA but from Boeing, one of the largest plane manufacturers.
Yes.
Boeing says that the African region, the fleet will more than double by 2043. Yeah, passenger air traffic in Africa will increase by 6.4% per annum. This means it will triple the traffic coming into Africa. And when you look at these figures, 82% of deliveries will be for growth and the highest percentage of any region. And Africa's freighter fleet will triple by 2043. Africa operators will need to hire and train 76,000 new pilots, maintenance, technicians, and cabin crew, tripling the region's active passengers. So when you look at how Boeing has already done their mathematics, they have already seen the demand will be there in Africa.
That's a projection, right?
Yeah. So if Boeing is projecting that by 2043, Africa will have tripled their aviation industry, that says that there's a lot of potential, there's a lot of prospect in the region. And I like what I'm seeing here in Rwanda. I saw they're putting up one of the largest airports.
Airports, yeah, Bugesera Airport.
I'm sure you can tell us more about this.
Well, when you talk about how governments or how these airlines are putting resources together, but still nothing is coming through, you remind me of the biblical narrative that the spirit is willing but the body is weak.
Yeah.
So for me, it's still there. It's just in the air, but it's still a question to ponder.
Yeah.
But there's a school of thought that in Africa, air transport, of course, you can tell that because of the terrain of the continent, air transport is a very good mode of transport for connectivity across the continent.
Yeah.
But there's a school of thought that in Africa, people use planes because of luxury. That's why when you probably enter a plane, the first thing you will do is to take a selfie to show that you have achieved a feat.
Yeah.
But in other countries, like in Europe, how you say it, it's actually low because it's a necessity. In Africa, it's looked as if it's luxury. What's your take on that?
Well, you've nailed the point on its head. I mean, aviation is so expensive. Flying in Africa is so expensive. Look at the example I shared. Flying to Kigali to Nairobi costs you about $600. With the same amount, you can fly to Dubai, which is way longer, almost 4 hours, you know? So it also confirms that we have to do much better as a continent. We have to sit back and draft policies that will be able to necessitate the industry's growth. I do know that the highest level at the East Africa community, there is draft proposals that will make the industry competitive. But it has to be fast-tracked, or else we may not be able to achieve this. And when you look at another interesting issue, I look at, apart from the taxes that are levied on air tickets, there's also the issue around including the fees that are coming when you're flying. There's, of course, the issue of parking, common user terminal equipment, and all this aviation lingua that we can be able to work around. Because when we look at the potential that Boeing is looking at the region, you've seen Boeing is saying by 2043, aviation will have tripled in terms of the aircraft their countries are ordering. Some countries are doing very well. They've managed to subsidize the prices, you know? So there's a lot of opportunity to go back to the drawing board and for countries to say, how do we structure these laws more to be more accommodative? How can airlines partner through partnerships that are going to help them take on different routes? When you look at developed airlines across the world, there's a lot of aviation partnerships through what they call code share agreements. This is where an airline gets into an agreement with another airline and says, carry my passengers, bring them to this and this hub, then I will take them to the final destination. Some airlines...
because it's also very common that no airline, okay, some have, but it's just a few that have direct flights.
Yeah.
You find most of the times there is a stopover somewhere.
Exactly.
Because, for example, if you go with Ethiopian Airlines, most cases there is a stopover in Addis Ababa. Same as if you use Rwandair, in most cases there's a stopover in Kigali.
Yeah.
This helps to, like you said, it eases the client's ability to reach their destination. But it's through a collective effort between these two airlines.
I like that.
So before all this came into light, there's, in the regional blocks, usually we talk about non-tariff barriers, we talk about things that should be put in place so that the regions coordinate more. Now, when it comes to airlines, or when it comes to air travel, I think there should also be something that not only connects the airlines themselves, but the countries through which these airlines originate or operate. Otherwise, we would just have like it would be like a drop in the ocean if we just let the airlines handle
their own business.
Mm.
Well, I like the direction you're taking us. When I sit back and look at the potential that aviation has, it is mind-boggling, because 18% of the world's population is in Africa. 18% of the global population is in Africa. And Africa's population is projected to quite really double by 2050. Right now, we are staring at about 1.3 billion people. So you can imagine in another 20 years, the numbers will be much better. One of the biggest conversations that we are yet to have is, how do we create the conducive environment for these enterprises to thrive, especially in the very competitive nature that aviation is. Aviation business is cutthroat competition, where people undercut each other through pricing, people undercut each other through lower taxes on fuel. Because when you look at the biggest cost in aviation is fuel cost on jet fuel, and then the cost coming in with the pilots. So it will be quite imperative for countries to see, how do we make our country competitive? Yeah. And this will all boil down to the whole conversation around, how can Africa decide where do we have a hub? For example, Addis Ababa is quite a known hub for taking a transit flight. How do we also make East Africa a hub, where if someone is traveling, let's say, to Southern Africa, they have to pass through Eastern Africa? And that is where the game changer lies.
Actually, Abby, before we even go to the hub, let's look at the expertise. Do we have, for example, in East Africa, do we have enough pilots, for example? Do we have people who have gone through aviation schools? How many aviation schools do we have in the region? To make this more professional, to make it easy to access, to make it easy to afford. How many, for example, I'm sure whenever I get a chance to travel by plane, I see most of the pilots are white. They cannot be Africans when they are white, you know? So is there enough expertise, for example, in Africa to start with?
Well, that's a good point to start on, because as it stands right now, the number of flying schools in Africa are not that many. We already have a huge disadvantage, because at the initial onset, the cost of aviation is not cheap. For even parents, you may have a child who is very talented, they're very good in their studies, but when you look at the cost of aviation, it becomes another big barrier to entry. That is one element. We don't have enough schools of training. Probably there are attempts to help scale up, but we have to really pull up our socks. Majority of the pilots end up getting trained in South Africa. And taking your child to study aviation in South Africa is not pocket change. It requires you to be quite liquid. And I feel these are the opportunities that government can step in and perhaps work very closely with the various institutions of training and see, how do we structure something that will be beneficial to our country. The average number of pilots produced per year, for example, in Africa, I would love to know, how has it grown over the years? I may not have the data now, but this is an area that transport ministers, people in the aviation space should be really looking towards. How do they make the cost of training cheaper, so that we have more and more people gaining interest in aviation and getting into this career, which is very rewarding. Of course, Africa is making some strides, but we are far away where we need to be, especially in terms of building the technical infrastructure, and this is very important because aviation really is heavy on human capital. Without the right human capital, we have to import the staff who work for the airline. So I know different airlines have different strategies that are helping them in terms of giving their staff exposure. And we're also witnessing a huge transition of African-trained pilots or cabin crews going to other carriers. I do know that, for example, the Gulf carriers, these are the likes of Emirates, the likes of Qatar Airways, Etihad, have been able to give more competitive packages.
Actually, that's where I was coming to. Let's assume the expertise is there. Maybe let's just assume people are trained, and on that level, we have no problem. How do we pay these people? That's a good question, because like you said, other carriers have better packages. Mm-hmm. But even beyond that, I'm looking at a scenario where, well, because we are Africans, we have been made to believe that we are a poor continent, and that will probably take a very long time to get erased out of our minds. But don't you think Africa, the poor continent, people are actually poor that they cannot afford these air tickets? Because if you look at if you look at how much we make, the economies are of course different. We can see very many different countries have different economies. But don't you think there is a reality in us being really poor that we cannot afford an air ticket?
I would tend to disagree. Look at the cars that people are driving on the streets of Kigali. Look at the cars people are driving on the streets of Nairobi, Kampala. It shows you there is a middle class. And this is the portion of the society that usually are targeted when it comes to flying. But on the other side, it also shows us that the element of poverty in Africa is also real. Because if people are seeing aviation as a luxury, then it says we have a big, big problem.
Exposure. We are not exposed. Probably we don't know why this is important. It is the quickest means of transport.
Exactly.
It is considered the safest means of transport.
Exactly.
But we are not exposed to it. So we just stay back in our backyards. And
I wouldn't say it's really about exposure, but it's about affordability. Because people would love to take a flight, but they opt to take a bus. For example, today if I'm going to watch a game in Kampala at Kololo, I'll take a bus. When I hear the cost of an air ticket versus a bus, I'm like, hey,
I can use this extra money for something.
This extra money, I can use it for other things. But I'd like to just bring up a very important point that you raised around airlines being able to be competitive. During the 2024, African airlines are expected to make profits of about $100 million. Yeah. Now, when you calculate this as earnings, per passenger, it amounts to about 90 US cents. Yeah. And this is quite low compared to the global average of 6.4 US dollars. And aviation is known for an industry that thrives on margins, because if your profit margin is low, then technically you're not making the money that is required. So I feel like Africa is at a crossroad, because on one hand, there's a lot of investment coming through the pipeline. Countries are trying to really up their game. When you look at South Africa, their airline is still struggling because of a number of factors, including high operational costs and also governance issues. So governance has to come in handy when it comes to running of some of these airlines, because embezzlement of funds, mismanagement, can cripple the airlines. We've seen some of the airlines, and there are examples in Nigeria, for example. The airline is no longer functional, their national airline. And the same applies to Somalia. The same applies to a few other countries because of governance. So perhaps as we rest this conversation, it is also critical that in as much as we are advocating for cheap air prices, improved facilities, better training, better packages for those working in aviation, there has to be also those running the industry must be accountable.
Abi, there's something very interesting here. You've talked about countries whose airlines are no longer functional because of one reason or another. I think Rwanda is a little bit lucky. I was reading here a report that actually Rwanda has been announced to host the Aviation Africa Summit and Exhibition 2025. It will be the 5th time the country is hosting this prestigious event. For me, it's as though the airline Rwandair, I'm now talking about Rwandair.
Yeah.
The airline is constantly growing, and the country is also getting opportunities to help this airline actually get more compacted and yeah. So I think we are lucky in a way. Should we say we are lucky, or these are deliberate efforts? And probably, let me pick a view from what do you think this summit will probably bring on table? It's in 2025, but Rwanda will be hosting it for the 5th time.
Yeah, I think Rwanda is well positioned in terms of setting up its aviation industry. And this summit speaks to the fact that Rwanda is strategically aligned with the global conversation around growing the African industry around aviation. When you look at such a summit, for Rwanda to host it, it technically means that countries within Africa will have the opportunity to showcase the investment options available in their countries. Right now, when you look at the cargo industry, it is also an area that has enormous untapped potential for Africa. When we look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, there's a lot of talk about Africa bridging trade. And airlines are simply corridors through which help a country to be able to grow its trade network. So by Rwanda hosting this summit, I believe that it will not only showcase to the world that Africa has what it takes, and at the same time, it will be a grand opportunity for investment, especially in the very underdeveloped segments of aviation. Because aviation right now, we are seeing a lot of business travel, people flying in for conferences. We are also seeing leisure travel where people are coming for holiday. So all this fits into the country's agenda, where Rwanda is looking towards using aviation as a tool towards attaining its national goals around attracting more people to visit the country and at the same time to invest in the country.
Well, Abi, thank you so much for sharing your insights. They are very helpful. We have learned a lot, but we look forward to discussing more interesting topics such as this. You, our viewer, kindly keep following us on all our platforms. And we hope next time you'll join us for a similar and probably more interesting conversation. Thank you so much. Bye-bye from us.